You don't miss them because they were special. You miss them because your mind learned to attach. That thought should make you uncomfortable, because it removes romance and replaces it with something colder and harder to accept. You tell yourself the attachment exists because of love, history, or connection that can't be replaced. But your body reacts before those stories appear, typing, reaching, replaying moments without asking your permission. If attachment were purely emotional, it would fade when logic explains why it shouldn't hurt anymore. Yet even when you understand a situation clearly, something inside you refuses to let go. You may believe you are holding on because you care deeply, because losing them would mean losing a part of yourself. But that belief hides something far more unsettling about how attachment actually forms and why it persists. Your mind confuses familiarity with safety, intensity with meaning, and absence with threat. What you call longing may not be love at all, but a conditioned response demanding relief. And the most disturbing part is how personal this feels. Even though it follows predictable psychological patterns, if attachment feels uncontrollable, it's because something else is deciding when you ache, when you hope, and when you break. So ask yourself quietly, without defending the answer, if your attachment continues even when it hurts you, what exactly is it protecting? But this is where things become uncomfortable. Most people believe emotional attachment is a conscious choice, something that grows because of shared experiences, memories, and genuine emotional investment. You tell yourself you are attached because you cared deeply, because the connection mattered, because what you felt was real and meaningful. It feels natural to assume attachment is simply the cost of intimacy, a consequence of opening yourself emotionally to another person. When the attachment hurts, you believe the pain is proof of depth, evidence that the bond was significant rather than superficial. You may even believe that time, distance, or finding someone new will naturally dissolve the attachment without resistance. There is comfort in this belief because it frames attachment as something noble, uncontrollable, yet understandable. It allows you to grieve without questioning the structure beneath the emotion. Without asking why the bond formed the way it did, you may think your attachment exists because of who they were, what they gave you, or how they made you feel seen. From this perspective, letting go feels like betrayal, as if releasing attachment means invalidating the relationship itself. You reassure yourself that once close your eyes, once answers are given, the attachment will loosen naturally. You trust that understanding the situation intellectually should be enough to calm the emotional pull. This belief keeps resistance low because it suggests nothing fundamental is wrong, only that healing requires patience. It allows you to wait, to endure, to hope that emotional distance will do the work for you. Yet despite time passing, explanations forming, and circumstances changing, the attachment often remains unchanged. The pull returns unexpectedly, triggered by memories, absence, or imagined futures that feel vivid and urgent. This persistence quietly suggests that attachment is not operating where you believe it is, and this is where most people misunderstand what's really happening. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. At some point, a subtle contradiction appears, quiet enough to ignore, but persistent enough to create discomfort beneath your explanations. You notice that attachment does not always align with how someone actually treated you, or how the relationship truly functioned. You may feel emotionally pulled towards someone you logically understand was inconsistent, unavailable, or even harmful to your stability. This creates confusion because attachment continues even when respect, trust, or reciprocity has clearly eroded. The mind begins to sense that something deeper than affection is sustaining the bond, You might catch yourself replaying moments that were emotionally intense rather than consistently supportive. The attachment feels strongest around uncertainty, absence, or unresolved emotional tension rather than genuine closeness. This is unsettling because it contradicts the belief that attachment grows from love alone. If attachment were purely about connection, clarity would weaken it, not intensify it. Yet clarity often does nothing, while emotional distance sometimes makes the attachment stronger. This suggests the attachment may not be attached to the person themselves, but to something internal activated by them. The emotional pull seems less interested in reality and more invested in possibility, memory, and imagined resolution. This is the first crack in the story you've been telling yourself. It introduces the idea that attachment may not be conscious, fair, or even relational in the way you assumed. And once this crack appears, it becomes difficult to unsee it. But to understand why this happens, we need to look at how the brain learned to attach this way in the first place. The brain does not form emotional attachment through logic, meaning, or intention in the way we like to believe. It forms attachment through patterns, repetition, and emotional reinforcement tied to survival mechanisms. From an early age, the brain learns to associate safety with certain emotional states, not necessarily healthy relationships. Moments of emotional intensity leave stronger imprints than moments of calm consistency. Unpredictability creates heightened attention, and heightened attention strengthens memory and emotional encoding. When affection, validation, or connection arrives inconsistently, the brain becomes alert and invested. This alertness is not romantic. It is neurological. The brain begins to track the person as a variable source of emotional reward. Each positive interaction becomes amplified because it interrupts uncertainty. This intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest conditioning patterns the brain can experience. It is the same mechanism that keeps people checking phones, replaying memories, and waiting for emotional signals. Over time, the brain associates the person with emotional resolution rather than emotional stability. The attachment forms not because the person provides peace, but because they activate anticipation. The nervous system becomes engaged, not relaxed. This is why attachment often feels urgent rather than calm. The brain believes something important is unfinished. It treats the emotional bond like an open loop that must be closed to restore equilibrium. Importantly, the brain does not distinguish between healthy completion and imagined completion. It simply seeks relief from unresolved emotional tension. This is why absence can intensify attachment rather than reduce it. Distance increases uncertainty, and uncertainty increases fixation. The brain keeps returning to the person mentally, not out of love, but out of conditioned expectation. This expectation is subtle and difficult to notice because it masquerades as longing or care. But underneath, it is a learned response. The brain has been trained to associate this person with emotional payoff. Not necessarily happiness, but relief. And relief, to the nervous system, feels like safety. This is where attachment becomes difficult to break, because it is no longer about the person at all. It is about the brain seeking completion of a pattern it learned to depend on. And the most uncomfortable part is realizing the brain may be getting something from this attachment you haven't questioned yet. Attachment is rarely just about love or fear. The mind receives subtle rewards every time it clings, even when you consciously dislike it. Each pull, each longing thought triggers dopamine, a chemical reassurance that something familiar persists. You feel momentary certainty, even if it is uncomfortable. This payoff is not visible. It hides behind anxiety, hope, or frustration, but the brain recognizes its usefulness in maintaining emotional consistency, even Pain can be addictive when it confirms that someone matters. Emotional intensity signals presence, signaling survival, signaling relevance. When someone is distant, your mind fills the gap automatically, creating stories that confirm attachment. These narratives feel necessary, as though your identity depends on them. The brain quietly benefits from tension. It strengthens pathways that predict emotional highs and lows, maintaining continuity in the familiar emotional world. You may hate the feeling of dependence, yet your system clings because uncertainty feels worse than discomfort. This is the hidden payoff. The mind is rewarded for repetition, for emotional rehearsals that keep you engaged and invested in another person. Even avoidance or detachment carries a payoff. The brain experiences control, which feels like safety, further reinforcing patterns. Understanding this payoff is uncomfortable because it reveals that clinging is not only choice but survival. It makes attachment not a moral failing, not a flaw, but a conditioned mechanism your brain has learned to rely on. And this is where most people misunderstand what is really happening, mistaking reinforcement for weakness. Attachment is not just behavior, it slowly becomes part of identity. You begin to define yourself through your connection to another. I am the one who cares too much, or I cannot live without them, becomes a statement repeated until it feels true. Logic cannot dissolve this because it is no longer a thought. It is a habitual self-concept deeply intertwined with self-perception. You may try reasoning yourself out of attachment, but the brain treats identity as survival, not argument, and therefore ignores logic when attachment defines identity. Every emotional spike confirms who you are. Every disappointment reinforces that self-image, whether conscious or unconscious. Even detachment can feel like a threat to existence because it challenges the established narrative your mind uses for continuity. The more you resist attachment, the more intense the internal friction becomes. Resistance signals danger to identity, triggering heightened emotional responses. Identity reinforces attachment because it provides a framework for meaning, for self-coherence, for the story that makes life predictable and understandable. You are no longer attached merely to someone else. You are attached to a version of yourself that exists through that connection. Breaking attachment is therefore not just about letting go of another, it is about observing a self-concept you never questioned. And this is where a new way of seeing the problem emerges. A perspective that doesn't rely on willpower or judgment. The mind begins to loosen grip when attachment is no longer seen as a weakness. It is not something to fix or conquer. Instead, attachment becomes a pattern, a passing process that occurs within awareness rather than defining identity. The shift is subtle, but profound. Observing attachment as a mental event interrupts identification without effort or resistance. You are no longer the one who clings, you are the one who observes the clinging. This perspective allows emotional intensity to exist without judgment, without attachment claiming ownership of self. Attachment does not disappear instantly, but it begins to lose urgency and emotional pressure. The mind's need for repetition diminishes when it is no longer fused with identity or survival. Patterns continue, but they are less convincing, less necessary, and less central to your experience. The emotional charge softens because presence replaces resistance, and awareness replaces judgment. You begin to notice the same thoughts, the same longing, but they no longer dominate attention completely. Observation provides space where reaction once lived uninterrupted. The mind begins to realize that nothing essential is being lost. Detachment is not enforced, it arises naturally through clarity, recognition, and unobstructed awareness. Attachment no longer requires victory or defeat. It is no longer a struggle, only an event passing through consciousness. And in this reframing, the quiet internal change begins without effort. without manipulation, and without expectation. At some point, the attachment loses its weight. Thoughts surface but do not command attention. They appear as transient events in awareness. Moments of neutrality emerge, small pauses where no solution, response, or control is required. This stillness is unfamiliar at first, but it does not feel uncomfortable. It is presence in its raw form. The mind begins to settle because emotional urgency is no longer fused with identity or fear. You are not detaching to control, to manipulate, or to prove something. You are simply present. Patterns continue to arise, but they are observed, not followed. Emotional repetitions lose their power without forceful intervention. Some days attachment feels more prominent, other days almost invisible. But it no longer dictates internal stability. You stop tracking progress or asking if you are detached enough. Presence replaces judgment, and observation replaces struggle. The self that required attachment to feel whole begins to loosen naturally, without effort or insistence. This quiet shift is subtle because it cannot be demanded or rushed. It arrives gently, almost unnoticed, and settles deeply. When this occurs, reflection becomes possible. You see the mind and its patterns without ownership, without resistance, and without expectation. And this is where self-reflection begins in earnest, quietly, calmly, and without judgment, preparing for the final mirror. Now pause and look inward, quietly observing how attachment shaped your thoughts without judgment or force. Notice the subtle shifts that have already begun within your emotional landscape, the small gaps between reaction and awareness. This reflection is not an exercise in pride or self-criticism. It is simply noticing what exists in this very moment. You may feel a strange unfamiliarity, as if watching your own mind from a distance. That distance is the mirror, the first glimpse of freedom from attachment without effort or rejection. Observe the emotional patterns that once seemed overwhelming, and notice how they no longer dominate your attention completely. You may feel relief, confusion, or neutrality, and all of these are valid, part of the process that has unfolded silently. The mirror does not provide answers or closure, only shows what has always been present: awareness, subtle, persistent, and unclaimed. Your identity is no longer fused with longing, no longer defined by emotional repetition. Instead, presence begins to feel like its own quiet stability, independent of attachment or obsession. This reflection is not about perfection or mastery. It is about observing reality without insisting it conform to expectation or desire. It is about noticing the pulse of your own awareness and understanding that change can occur without force. And in this final mirror, you begin to understand that freedom from attachment was not created. It was uncovered. A presence already existed beneath reaction, waiting quietly to be seen, recognized, and experienced. And when you see it, the world and your inner self feel slightly lighter, slightly quieter, and profoundly more honest. Attachment, longing, and emotional repetition are not enemies. They are patterns, conditioned responses quietly waiting to be observed rather than controlled. You have seen the way attachment shaped your identity, and how subtle awareness can loosen its grip without struggle or judgment. This awareness is not a tool. It is not a strategy. It is a presence that quietly refrains how experience occurs. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be corrected. Observation alone begins to shift the internal landscape. The mind gradually understands that reaction does not define identity, and emotional repetition does not dictate who you are. You can return to this mirror anytime. Watch your responses. Notice the pull of attachment, and allow awareness to remain quietly present. No resolution, no finality, only presence and observation. And this is where your reflection remains unfolding, quiet and open-ended, waiting to be seen again tomorrow or next year, exactly as it is.